out there in Twitch land. My name is Gabe Hollombe, and I am a technical evangelist here at AWS. I'm coming to you live from our office in Singapore. It's 7:50 p.m. here, but we've got one more session from me here in Singapore, and we've got more live coding sessions to come later on throughout the rest of the Innovate conference as the conference follows the sun heading west. So, what we're going to do in today's session, hopefully, in the next hour or so, we're running 10 minutes behind schedule, so I might try and compress it down into 50 minutes if I'm ambitious and lucky. We're going to try and wire up a simple React web application to an API powered by GraphQL, which is in turn powered by AWS AppSync, which is our managed GraphQL service in the AWS cloud. I will use the AWS amplifi open source JavaScript library to make my life easier in this task. And that's about it. I'll look for questions along the way. If you have any questions, just drop them in the chat. I'll try and catch them. If I miss them, I've got some mods that are also hanging out in the channel who will get my attention. I'm joined by my colleague Ash here in the room with me, who's off camera. So if you hear another voice, it's her trying to get my attention to make sure that I answer a good question that came up in the chat. Also, I just saw a question right before the stream started asking from Mark Stevenson, is this one we can code along with or similar to the last one? You can certainly try and code along with me. That would be fine. I'm going to go back and forth between code, docs, and my browser a bit. But also, I would say maybe you just want to sit and watch and follow along with the recorded video, which will be available a little while after this stream ends on the channel's video page. So maybe just pay attention, ask questions as you go, and we'll go from there. Cool. So here we go. Let me show you what we're going to build today. If you can look up on my screen here, what I've got is a simple sign-in page. And I'll go ahead and just sign in with a username and password. And you'll notice I also have a forgot password and sign up functionality down here. And once I'm signed in, I get a little loading symbol and then some events load. It's not going to win any awards in the HTML design department. The goal of this stream is not to teach you how to build beautiful looking interactive web applications. That would be an entirely different topic. I'm going to focus on wiring up all this together with React and amplifi and AppSync. So what you can see is that we have a little header at the top which shows my username and gives me a sign out button. And we've got a simple form here that'll let me add new events with the name, description, a where and a when. And we have a listing of existing events that are in our data source. So what we can do is, we can type a new event here. So we'll just say, this is another Innovate stream. And this is going to be, it's cool, where, online, when, 2018-07. Today is the 19th for me in Singapore. So we'll type that. Now, what you'll notice here is that it doesn't come through in the list, and that's because in this example, I hadn't wired up subscriptions live yet, but if I refresh the page, we'll see it here. And hopefully by the end of the stream, I'll actually have auto subscriptions also wired in, so we won't even have to refresh to see our data changes come in from our local client or any other clients that manage to make mutations to our GraphQL endpoint. Okay, so let's get started. Good, Mark Stevenson. I'm glad that this is a big area of interest for you. Please let me know if you have any questions along the way. That's what this stream is all about. So let's start by creating a simple React app. So I will just here make a new React app. And I'm just using React because I like it. It's nice and simple with a small surface area of its API. And I will call it Innovate GraphQL 3 because this is the third session I've done for this. And we'll just wait a second for the create React app script to set me up with a default React application. If you're new to React development, I strongly recommend using the create React app tool from Facebook. It's a great way to get started. Okay. So inside my Innovate GraphQL 3 folder, I can now just type npm start. Let me also just quickly off screen kill my other server that I had running. Okay. And now you'll notice that we're just going to have a default React app with nothing fancy here, just the standard stuff. So let's go ahead and edit this. The file we're interested in is the app.js file here in the source directory. And let me know if the font size is illegible or anything like that. We don't need the logo. I'm not going to work on the styling, so I could leave the CSS in here or I could take it out. Let's take it out for this one. Doesn't really matter. I'm also going to get rid of all the fun stuff inside of our default HTML. Just start with a div and we'll say, hello, Innovate 2018, if I can type correctly. I'll save that and we'll go back to the browser and it auto refreshes and there is my message. So that's great. I've just got a nice standard React app up here, but I know that it's working. It's a good baseline. Cool. So yes, VS Code, I'm a fan. Castoro, it's pretty great. I wish it was on Vim. Well, I'm using the Vim extension for VS Code and I find it pretty good. So there's no reason not to try VS Code if you have Vim fingers like I do from years and years of Vimming. Okay, so we have a standard React app and we can make it put things on the web. But what I would like to do now is add some authentication to this before we get started with the app sync and the GraphQL integration. So let's do that. The easiest way to do that is to use the AWS Mobile Hub and the corresponding AWS Mobile CLI. Now, if you didn't know that from listening to me here on the stream, you could figure it out by looking at the AWS Amplify JavaScript library documentation. So in short, Amplify, I know there's a lot of terms here that I'm throwing around, but they're pretty easy to keep track of once you get comfortable with it. Amplify is an open source JS library for making your life easier, for working with a lot of different APIs in the cloud, from adding authentication to working with REST and GraphQL endpoints to doing pub sub and things like that. There's a whole lot of options. Let me just show you in the quick start where you could learn a lot. So if you're using React like I am, we could do this. We already did this stuff. We can install AWS Amplify. I don't need to do this because I'm going to use the AWS Mobile CLI, which will automatically detect that I'm in a React app, and it will add the AWS Amplify and React higher order components as well. So if you haven't installed AWS Mobile CLI, you can do it like that. You can configure it. I've already done so. And so then to set up your backend, I can just say AWS Mobile init in my directory. I don't need to give it a project name. It'll give me one automatically. So AWS Mobile init. And I can accept all of these defaults. They map very nicely to what Create React app sets up for us. And what do we want to name our project in Mobile Hub? We'll just call it Innovate GraphQL 3 plus a date stamp, the default. It's a fine name. And within just a minute, what we'll have is some resources provisioned for us automatically in our AWS account without us having to go into the web console and click a bunch of things manually, and also without us having to write any sort of cloud configuration scripts. By default, it sets up some event tracking for us using the Amazon Pinpoint service, which is a good service for doing things like sending app events like user sign-ins and sign-ups, and then you can do things like segment your user population later to send targeted SMSs, push notifications, etc. We're not going to use that in this demo, but it does set that up. It also sets up out of the box a nice way to publish to a CDN. So for example, even just right now, I can type AWS Mobile publish, and it'll run my script to build my React app. And this is just using the standard stuff from Create React app. It will upload the files to S3, and it will then, it's already set up a CloudFront distribution for those static files on S3. And so here we go. Without me having to do any configuration, I have a nice URL. Well, it's certainly a long URL, but the point is I have a URL that's out there. It's backed by CloudFront, and it will deliver this resource to my users wherever they are in the world from a nice local point of presence. So just a good thing to keep in mind. Anyway, what I'm more interested in doing though is adding sign up and sign in. So let's do this. AWS Mobile user sign in enable, and I'm going to say -p because I'd like to provide some additional configuration. I'll go to advanced settings. Now, AWS Mobile gives you a few different options for setting up how you want your users to authenticate. I'm going to use Cognito user pools, which would let my users register with their own usernames and passwords. That's what I was showing in my demo. If I wanted to, I could also set up federated identity provider sign-in from things like Facebook or Google or any OpenID Connect compatible provider or any enterprise SAML style provider. But for this case, we'll just use Cognito user pools because it's simple. How long does it take CloudFront to get updated if it's geo-distributed? Asks Castor0. I'm not sure on the exact timings, but there you can read in the documentation how long it might keep something cached for. I'm not going to pull that up right now, but maybe one of the mods will be able to link you to something. That's a good question, though. Thank you. So I'm going to switch this to use a username here for how users are going to log in. I'll accept 8 as a minimum password length. And we'll go with, I'm going to turn off, these are all good things to do when you're setting up requirements for passwords, but I'm going to turn them all off for this stream so I don't have to remember a complicated password that I am going to have to type. Cool, and now I can just say AWS Mobile Push, and that will take this user setup that I've done and go ahead and affect that change in my AWS account. Behind the scenes, this is provisioning for me a Cognito user pool as well as a Cognito identity pool. If you've never used Cognito before, it's our sign up, sign in style service that's comprised of these two parts, a user pool and an identity pool. The easy way to think about it is the user pool is where it keeps track of usernames and passwords and that sort of stuff about a user, where the identity pool is how what ways do we support providing credentials, temporary credentials to AWS services. And so when users use our app after they log in, instead of having to embed an API key directly in our app, which you certainly wouldn't want to do for a JS app because the browser has access to all the source, you can get temporary credentials for each of your users automatically through Cognito, and the amplifi library makes that a breeze to do, as you'll see. So we've done that. Now, if you didn't know how to, that command, which was AWS mobile user sign in enable, I can show you here in the docs how I learned that, because I always like showing people how to get comfortable with the docs. So I go over to the authentication, and it talks about Cognito and what it is, which we sort of covered, so you can read more about that. And you can see we did basically these commands just like the docs say. So now to use this in my React app, I'm going to go ahead and just teach the amplifi library, or I'm going to pull in the amplifi library and configure it with the AWS exports file that was generated from the AWS mobile CLI. So just to show you, here's all the configuration for my app right now. The idea is this file is managed by the Mobile Hub and the mobile CLI, so we don't have to worry about it, and Amplify knows how to read all the settings out of here. So from the docs, I just had to pull in some imports and tell Amplify to configure itself. And then if we go back, we can look and see there's different sign-in options to customize. I already went through some of this. You can read more about it later. And then now, if you wanted to write your own authentication UI, you have a number of options, but the way it would work is you'd build your own UI, and then you would use these different functions off the auth object in Amplify in order to affect the different changes that you need to make, like sign in or confirm sign in, sign up, etc. and sign out. But we don't need to do that. If you look down here, you'll notice there's also a section of documentation called using with authenticator HOC, or higher order component. And that's what I want. Because we're using a React app, as it says here for React and React Native apps, we can add the with authenticator higher order component, and that will turn our app into something that requires authentication with just this one line of code. So I do have to pull in one more import line to import that higher order component from the AWS Amplify React library. So let me do that. And then down here, instead of using just exporting our app, we're going to use with authenticator. I'm going to authenticate it with the app, and I'm going to add one more thing here, which is include greetings true, and close my paren. And that will give me the sign out button in the header. And you can see that here. If we scroll down a little bit more, there's something in the documentation here for rendering a sign out button. And that's how I knew what to do there. Let me just check about questions here for a minute. Oh, cool. We're getting questions answered from the mods. Thank you, Razor. All right. So I haven't saved it yet, but let's see with this one line of code, let's see how our app transforms. If I come back to the app now, look, I've got a nice sign-in screen. I've got the forgot password. I can sign up. Now, I have to sign up before I sign in because this is not the demo I just showed you. This is our fresh cloud provision environment. So I'll need to create an account first. So I'll make a username and password, and I'll add my email, which it will use to let me verify that I own this account. I'm going to just type in a fake phone number here. As much as I love you all on Twitch, I don't want you all calling me tonight to tell me how much you love the stream. You can tell me in the chat. Thank you. And now it's going to ask me for a code. So this code is going to show up in my email inbox, which I will pull up here off screen, so you also don't have to look at all the unread messages in my inbox. And I'll paste that code in that I just got in my email, and I'll click confirm. So I just told Cognito that I have control of the email address that I used to register, and now I could use the forgot password functionality if I needed to reset my password. But I do remember what I wrote, I think, and let's see what happens if I sign in now. Yep, there we are, back at our screen before, and now, as you can see, we've got this nice little login header already created for us with the sign out button. So, there we go. Welcome, Sumidade. Glad to have you on the stream. The text is getting hidden by the video. Please scroll a bit. Sorry. Good, thank you. I need to remember to show content at the top of the screen because we've got my little video in the bottom. So thank you for that, Shankar. I hope you can see it now. Basically, all I did was add this one line of code here on line 19. I wrapped my app React class, which I was exporting before, with the with authenticator higher order component and told it to include greetings. Cool. So moving on, what we have now is an authenticated app, but we haven't yet done any of the integration with GraphQL or AppSync. So right, there's no dynamic content in this yet, other than it showing the username that I used to register. So let's do that. Before we get into that, I need to tell you what GraphQL is and why you should care in case you don't know. I like from graphql.org/learn, which redirects you to graphql.github.io/learn. On this homepage, they've got a great introduction to GraphQL. This is where I first learned about GraphQL, and so I recommend it to people because it did a good job, I think, teaching me about it. And I really like what they say here in this second paragraph. Namely, GraphQL is a query language for your API and a server-side runtime for executing queries by using a type system you define for your data. GraphQL isn't tied to any specific database or storage engine and is instead backed by your existing code and data. So let's unpack that a bit because I think there's often some misunderstandings about GraphQL and what it is. When I'm out in the field, a lot of times I hear people say, GraphQL, isn't that what I need to work with graph databases? Nope. GraphQL has nothing to do with graph databases. You can use GraphQL to work with content that's inside of graph databases, but GraphQL is completely technology agnostic. It doesn't care what kind of database or data storage layer you're using at all. It is just a specification that says, here is how clients should communicate with this API. Here are the data types that are allowed to be passed back and forth, the shape of that data. Here are the queries that the client is allowed to use and what fields the client is allowed to ask for in response to those queries for fulfilling the different data types. And also here are the mutations that the client can affect against the API. That's it. And you can read more about that here. But with just that introduction, I'd rather show you more through working code rather than just explaining concepts because I find that's the easiest way to understand this stuff. So the next thing you need to know is that AWS AppSync is our managed GraphQL service in the cloud. It makes it very easy to build data-driven apps with real-time and even offline capabilities. For the purposes of this stream, I'm really just going to focus on the data-driven and the real-time part and not really get into the offline capabilities. But you can read much more about it here on the AppSync product page, but also you're about to see it in action in real life. So here we go. I want to provision a new AppSync API, and I would like it to automatically be configured for my project. So I'm going to use the AWS Mobile CLI again and just say AppSync enable, and I want to configure that as well. I would like to use Amazon Cognito user pools, and it'll automatically detect the user pool ID for me. And I will pick the region and not git, AWS mobile push, not git push. And now what's going to go ahead behind the scenes and happen is the following. Because it's often easier to get started learning something new by seeing an example and not just an empty blank slate, the AppSync team, by default, when you create a new API without providing any schema to the API, generates a default schema for you. That's the simple event management system I'm going to show off in the rest of the stream. It's basically just a simple system that lets you say, here's an event, The event can have comments. The event has, a name, a description, a where, and a when. It's a pretty simple API structure, but it's going to create that schema. It's also going to create the resolvers behind the scenes that will manage those GraphQL types for us and convert them to and from a DynamoDB data store. Now, a piece of jargon I just mentioned was resolvers. That's just GraphQL speak for the pieces of code that are responsible for reading and fetching and writing the different data types of your API. And I'll show you more of that in a minute, so it'll make more sense. How would I configure AWS Mobile with CI/CD is a question asked by Shinlastar. That's a good question. Let me think. How would I suggest that? So I would say AWS Mobile is made for provisioning the resources that your app is going to use in the AWS cloud. It's not. It doesn't have a strong opinion about CI or CD, but I could use some of the features of it to automatically test. When I do AWS Mobile Publish, for example, I know I'm going to publish a version to an endpoint. I might have something set up so that instead of doing it that way, I have a webhook fire off whenever I push things to my Git repository, and have that kick off a CI/CD pipeline that ends up doing the publish rather than me doing it directly from my account. Farhamzar 1985. You can see a recording of this afterwards in this Twitch channel's videos list. It'll come on. Most of the streams have been showing up 30 to 60 minutes after the stream ends, so stay tuned and hopefully we'll be able to get this one up into that time as well. Okay, so let's go ahead and see the AppSync API console now. So the easiest way to do that is you can come to the web console in AWS. Here I am signed into my account already. I can type AppSync, I can type GraphQL, doesn't really matter, but pick the AWS AppSync service there and it'll load up. Question from Dream Warfare. Cool name. What are we doing? Dream Warfare. What we are doing is building a simple event management web application powered by GraphQL using AWS AppSync, which is our managed GraphQL endpoint service on AWS, and the AWS Amplify JavaScript library, which makes working with cloud services on AWS very easy. Looks like I've signed out, so let me go ahead and sign back in here. There we go, security for the win. Okay, and there's my API in AppSync that got created, Innovate GraphQL 3. And what you can see here is the setting is set to use Amazon Cognito user pools, just like I configured. And I'll show you why that's relevant again in a minute. But let's kick in now and look at the schema. So here is our schema that was automatically provisioned for us as a simple way to get started and understand AppSync at a glance. Let's look at it from the bottom up. So all GraphQL schemas have this entry point. It's this schema keyword root node. And from there, every schema is probably going to have queries. It might have mutations. It might have subscriptions, but it's probably going to have at least queries. In this case, we have queries, mutations, and subscriptions defined. All of these follow the same pattern where you've got an identifier and the data type. So let's look at the query data type. So type query. So here we are defining the different types of queries that our API will support. And you can see we've got two. Get event, which takes in an ID of type ID, and that bang there means it's a required field. This ID is an atomic type in GraphQL, and in this case, it's going to be a UUID. And this returns a data type of type event. The other thing we can do is call list events, which has optional arguments for limit and next token, and that gives us back an event connection. What is an event connection? An event connection is just a simple data type that contains a items property, which has a list of 0 or more events, and a next token attribute. And we can use that to paginate through our list events for further pages of results if they don't all fit on the first page, for example. What is an event? An event is just a data type we've defined that's comprised of the following GraphQL atomic types. We have ID, name, where, when, and description. Those four are just string values. And a nice thing to point out is that in GraphQL, your data types can have other data types nested inside them. For instance, here an event has comments, and that can be parameterized as well. So that could have limits and next token. This is basically just like a sub query on a particular event to get all the comments associated with that event. And that gives us back a comment connection, which, no surprise, looks the same shape, and comments have an event ID, a comment ID, a content, and create event. But we're not going to focus on comments for the rest of the stream, so don't worry about it. We're just going to worry about events. So that's what the schema that's created for us looks like. Let's go ahead and interact with GraphQL so you can see that in action. Then I'll show you how this works a little bit behind the scenes. So can we import schemas from other services? I see a question there from Shankar. You can't import schemas from other services, but what you can do is you can generate a schema from existing data sources, or you can do the opposite where you type in some data types and have AppSync generate appropriate data sources for the types that you've generated. For example, I could just define some types and say, make me DynamoDB tables for that, and it'll handle it. I'll get into that in a little bit more detail in a minute when I show you how data sources are wired up. But first, let's look at queries. So if you've never used GraphQL before, this will be pretty cool to you, I think. If you have used something like GraphiQL before, it's just a GUI in the GraphQL community for working with and exploring GraphQL APIs. It looks like this. We have something very similar. But you'll notice that first, I need to log in with my user pool ID because we've told our AppSync API only users who successfully authenticate with the particular Cognito user pool should be able to hit this API. So I need to give it a client ID. The username and password is going to be what I created from my web app, but I need to know what to put here. It's not that. So the easiest way for me to find that is to look inside my AWS exports file. You can see here, wait, I could also pull it from the web console in AWS Mobile, but I know it's just this. The AWS user pool's web client ID. That's the client ID it's talking about. I like to pull it from the config because it's faster than me having to load something in the web. And with that in place, I can log in to the Query Explorer here, and we should be good to go. So for example, I can say, I want to write a query, and you can see there's autocomplete here too. And I want to use the list events query, and from that, I just want to get all events, the items from them, and I would like to see the ID. What have I mistyped here? Query list events from that. Oh, there's a colon. Why did I put a colon there? I'd like the ID and the name back. And if I run that query, you can see here I get back all GraphQL responses that return data have a data node at the root of the JSON response. And here you can see I get back from list events, from my items, an empty array, because should be no surprise, we haven't entered any data into this API yet. So Zarkerbd asks, can I use this for MySQL and how to connect with it? I'll get to that in a minute. The short answer is yes. So here, let me go ahead and save this query. I'll just call it all events. This is just me giving it a name here in the editor so I can have multiple statements here and choose which one I want to execute. And now let's do a mutation. And suppose I don't remember what I need to type here. I can even explore the documentation right here. So I can say, what mutations do I have? Oh, I've got create event. That needs the following parameters, etc. So you can browse the docs, the generated schema documentation there if you want. Create event. To create an event, I need to give it a few pieces of information, specifically name, where, when, and description. So I'm going to put these on new lines because I think it's easier to read. So we'll say Innovate 2018, where, online, when, 2018 07 19, because that's when with my date here in Singapore, if I can type it. The description. It's an online conference. Live coding is fun. Now, all mutations also need to specify what fields they want back. So I could just ask for the ID back, for example, and I've got some syntax problems somewhere. What have I done wrong? It wants me to give it a name because I gave this one a name. That makes sense. So I'll just call this new event. Doesn't matter what I call it. Cool. So I could use a keyboard shortcut to run this, but I can also just pick from up here which one of my statements I want to run. And there we go. And so it created a new event for me, or at least it created some sort of ID for me. Now, what happens if we come back and we run our list events query again? There it is. And you can see here that it gave me back the ID and the name because that's what I asked for here. So a key value of GraphQL is clients can ask for just the data they know they need to render the UI that they're working with. This is different than, say, the olden days of me building lots of REST APIs where you would decide ahead of time, here's what the representation of a particular resource looks like, and here's the shape of that data. And then you might be overfetching because your client that you're working on doesn't need all that data for a particular resource, but you're stuck pulling it all over the wire because that's what was defined in the API. In this case, we can say, oh, here are the only fields that I care about. For example, I could add description here and rerun this query, and now I'll get description as well. Cool. Welcome, Joker Pulpy, to the stream. Any way to change different databases other than DynamoDB tables? Asks Turing lived here, like your screen name Turing. The answer is yes. I'll show you more about that in a second. Can you disable the default project skeleton and start from scratch? Yes, you can. Although if you do that, you need to create the AppSync API from the web console directly and not from the command line with Mobile Hub. Can you apply simple filters in the query if possible? Short answer, Shankar, is yes. We just recently announced some new features for AppSync a few days ago, earlier this week. I can just quickly go to AWS What's New and show you where to learn more about that right now if you'd like. Let's see if I can find it here. Let's see all the announcements because then they'll all be displayed in order. Oh, cool. So here you go. You can read more about some of the very new recent features here. Just search for AWS What's New and look at the announcement from the 17th. And you can see, in addition to other data sources, which I'll talk about, we support HTTP endpoints as well, which makes it very easy to point to existing REST APIs and say, make this a GraphQL, a GraphQL data source for AppSync. Furthermore, you can do, let's see if this talks about the other things. Well, I'll let you read it. I'm not going to read it on the stream, but the point is that yes, here it is. Yeah. The process includes a new query and filtering system that allows logical comparisons. So that's a very recently added feature. We're building new features all the time. Something I think is really impressive is that over 90% of the roadmap of features that we work on here at AWS across our services is derived directly from customer feedback. So if there's a feature you want that's not there yet, AppSync is developing at a rapid pace, as are all of our services. And so I encourage you to just submit your feedback through your AWS account, because that's how we get the feedback. And we respond to it. Okay, how to configure the AWS Cognito user pool. Mobile Hub and the AWS Mobile CLI did that for me automatically, VJ. But you can learn more about that if you want, looking at the amplifi documentation under authentication. It'll describe a bit more about what you need to do there. All right, moving on. So I've shown this working, but I haven't shown how it works yet. Let me just quickly unpack that. So in this example, it set up a data source for DynamoDB, for the events and for the comments that each live in their own DynamoDB table. DynamoDB is our NoSQL data service in the cloud. It provides flexible schemas. It's designed to be extremely fast, so very consistent, very fast read and write performance. That's very, very scalable. If you're a fan of NoSQL, you'll probably like DynamoDB. If you're not, you have other options to work with AppSync right now. And just to point that out, because other people were asking, I don't want to use DynamoDB, what else can I use? So here, DynamoDB table, that's one. So another option is Elasticsearch. So if you want to do a lot of fuzzy searching or maybe geo-fenced searches, for example, geo-filtered searches, if you have data set up in an Amazon Elasticsearch domain, you can use that as an automatic data source, which I'm not going to get into for this stream, but it's worth looking at the docs if that interests you. The really cool one are these last two. So AWS Lambda function. If you're familiar with Lambda, as you'll know, it's our service that lets you run arbitrary functions in the cloud in a number of popular programming languages. This is really your escape hatch to do absolutely anything, because you can use a Lambda function to read from a static file or make a call out to a RDS database, like maybe Postgres or MySQL or Aurora, or a database running that's not on RDS anywhere in the cloud. You can run any code as long as it runs on Lambda and in your favorite Lambda programming language, and have it return whatever data you want. So you can use that to affect lookups and mutations for your data types anywhere that Lambda could end up making a call to. And this new one is an HTTP endpoint, as I mentioned, that will take existing REST endpoints and allow you to use them as data sources as well. So pretty neat. But what I wanted to do was spend just a minute showing you how this example schema even ends up translating to and from DynamoDB. So you'll see here on the right-hand side, if we look at our mutations, here's our create event mutation, and I'll click on here where it says AppSync event table. And here I can see the resolver for AppSync that is configured. Now, this might look a little bit weird at first, especially if you've never used DynamoDB. But if you have used DynamoDB, it won't look that weird. Basically, what we're saying here is AppSync has tight integration with Dynamo, as it does with Elasticsearch. And if you give it a template here that's formatted a certain way, what you're basically doing is teaching AppSync how to translate what came in from GraphQL into a DynamoDB operation and how to read the results of that DynamoDB operation back and translate it back into JSON to give to the GraphQL client. Here we're saying I want to do a put item DynamoDB operation on my table, which I know is keyed on an attribute called ID, which is a string, which a value I'm going to use a utility function called AutoID, which will generate me a UUID. And here I'm going to pass in the name, the where, the when, and the description, which all come through in this context variable under context.arguments. What is going on here is this is a template written in something called a Velocity templating language. That's an Apache project. It's open source. You can take a look at it. But it's not that hard to get used to. And what's nice about this is I don't have to worry about writing my own Lambda for simple operations that are going to map to existing DynamoDB operations, for example. There's also a number of templates to get you started, so you don't have to just look at the generated ones. There's a number of ones here to help you get familiar with what you need to put here. And the documentation is also really good. So if you pull up the AppSync documentation, it's extremely comprehensive. There's a whole lot here. But for example, one of my questions when I was getting started was, well, how do I know the shape of these templates that I can use, especially for working with, say, DynamoDB? Well, you can look at the resolver mapping template for DynamoDB reference, and I can see all the different operations here. For example, query. And I can see, okay, if I want to do a DynamoDB query against a table, what does the shape of that template need to look like? Hopefully that makes sense to everyone. Okay, so that's the sort of how it works. But what we haven't done yet is integrated this with our web app. We've just seen me mess around in the console. So let's finally stitch this all together. How do we do that? Again, AWS Amplify JavaScript library to the rescue. You'll notice there's a section here in the documentation called API. And inside here, we have a section called Working with GraphQL. If you read this, you'll see there's only a few things we need to do. We've already done this, except for we haven't imported API. I'll pull that in. But if you read a little bit more, you can see that if you're using AWS AppSync, so if you're using any GraphQL endpoint, you can use Amplify. You don't have to only use Amplify with AppSync. But if you are using AppSync, it's even easier. You can just do what I've done here, as you already saw me do. And we already have these two lines in our file, so we're good to go. As I said, Amplify knows how to read everything from the AWS exports file, which the mobile CLI took care of populating appropriately. And so how do we actually get data out of our GraphQL API? Well, it's pretty simple. So you can define just a string here. This is just a multi-line JavaScript string. And this looks exactly like what we were writing inside the Query Explorer before. And then, so that would be just a simple query without parameters, but you can also do it with parameters like this, where you define, it's still just a JS string, but you're going to define the placeholders and the data types that they require. And then you're going to pass those data types into the arguments that the query expects. And then you just go ahead and fetch your data just like you would before. And so here it is stitched all together. Basically, you're going to import API and GraphQL operation from AWS Amplify, and then you're going to pull in and either do, this is an asynchronous operation, so we can use the await keyword if we're using a modern JavaScript, or Create React app will take care of making this work for us. We can say API.GraphQL, pass it the result of this GraphQL operation function, which just takes whatever this is and makes it something we can pass to GraphQL, this GraphQL function. In this case, you're either passing it a string or you're passing it a string and then an object that has variables that map to the variables inside your query template. So cool, Gabe. Thanks. I'm glad you like it, Abanyet7. So let's show this in action. I want to make sure we can get this done. I want to go down a little bit further and show you that instead of even doing that, our life can be even easier. There's a React component to help us. So there's a React component called Connect. And so I definitely want to use that. So first I'm going to import these lines here, and then I'll show you what that's doing. Okay, so amplify we're already importing. We're just going to add GraphQL operation as an import from AWS Amplify, and then we're going to add connect, which is another component from our AWS Amplify React library. And then I'm just going to go ahead and pull this example code here instead of typing it all out because it does exactly what I want to illustrate. So we're going to replace our little hello world here with what we had in the documentation. Oh, looks like I typed something wrong. Let me try that again. Did I get all my parentheses right for that? I'm going to go from the renders open paren. Whoa, that was way too much. Sorry, it's the end of the day. My fingers are a little bit twitchy. Let's go back and try this again. Okay. All the way to there. I don't need the return. There we go. Okay. So reading this backwards, what we're going to do is we're going to use the connect high order component, which just wants us to pass it a query, which you already know. We're just going to use the list event string and wrap that with a GraphQL operation. And then what the connect component will do for us is when our React app renders, it will go ahead and query our data source for us, or our GraphQL endpoint. It will pull the data back and provide it to this function that you pass into the connect component. And that function is expecting a few pieces of data in a certain shape, and then you can do whatever you want with it. This is using 2 levels of JavaScript destructuring, which I think might be a little bit hard to read. So I'm going to clean this up a little bit. Basically, this is just a function defined in line here that I know it accepts an object that has a data field or property, a field for a flag for if it's loading data or if it's already fetched it, and a list of errors if there are any. And then what I want to do here is I'll make this a multi-line expression instead of a single expression. And I just want to change this a little bit. I'd like to say, if I'm loading, I just want to return a div that says loading. Looks like I put a slash there. Otherwise, if my errors length is greater than 0, errors will always be an array. It'll just be empty if there's no errors. Then I'm just going to return a div that says json.stringify. I need to put that in brackets or it won't execute as JavaScript. I want to stringify my errors. And finally, if there's no data dot list events, I want to just return. And then if I've passed all of those guard clauses, I can go ahead and return the result of this list view component where I'm passing data.listEvents.items in. This list view is just another component defined right here, a simple functional component that just renders based on the events it was passed, a little header, and then it maps over each of the events and emits a list item with the event ID as the key property, so React doesn't complain to us, with an event name and the event ID in parentheses. Hopefully that makes sense to everyone. That's what it looks like again on screen. Let me just, there, now we can see the whole thing, and hopefully that's not in the way of my face. And, or the other way around, my face isn't in the way of the code. If we refresh this, we see a little loading, and then there comes our data. So that's it. That's how easy it is to pull data from a GraphQL endpoint, in this case using AppSync, right into our React app using the Amplify JavaScript library. Pretty easy. I see the mess is asking, are there any Angular components or is there only React? I'm glad that you think I'm explaining really clearly. Thank you for that positive feedback. If I remember right, I think that there is some support for some Angular, but not for, as far as I remember, not for the React stuff yet. I think some things inside AWS Amplify, let me see. Pretty sure that we have some support for Angular. Yeah, and so there's a couple couple pieces of code here about that. Here's the Angular section of the Amplify library. You can read more about how to use Angular with Amplify if that interests you. The mess. Hope that's helpful. Cool. All right. So moving on. We have been able to read from our API, but we haven't written to it yet. So how do we do that? Well, let's go back to look at the docs, because the docs are how you learn, and it's not magic. If you look here, we can go back to working with the GraphQL, using GraphQL client, and then looking at mutations. It's not going to be surprising to you, I hope. It's going to look very similar. So here we have a create event mutation that's just a string that's templatized the same way as our queries were. And in order to make the mutation, if you have an object that has all the properties that you need to pass into your mutation like this, then you can just say await api.graphql, where you say pass a GraphQL operation, give it the name of your string containing your mutation and an object with the variables that it should templatize into that. And away you go. It's just that simple. Now, I'm going to make a form, and rather than just hard coding these event details, we're just going to drop a form in here that does the same thing. And in the interest of time, so you don't have to watch me type all of this out, I'm just going to cheat a little bit. I hope you don't mind. I'm going to paste something, but I will walk you through all of the lines of code so it will make sense. All right, here's what I've done. I've pasted another React component here called event form. This constructor just basically starts out setting its state with some properties, name, description, where, and when, all equal to empty strings. And then let's look at the rest of this from the bottom up. So when it renders, what is it doing? It's just outputting 4 different input elements of type text with different HTML name attributes, with some nice placeholders, so we don't have to put labels on this form for the purpose of this stream. They're each using the same handle change handler to keep track that'll handle mutating the React state when this component changes. And then their values will bind to the current state values for the component. And finally, we have a button that when you click it will fire its add event handler. Let's just look at that. So the handle change is literally just going to do the following, right? Ultimately, it's just going to set state with some object. That object starts out as an empty object, and then we just use the dynamic object property assignment here to say from the event.target, that was the input element that changed. Look at its name attribute and use that as the property we want to update in our little update object, and use its value for the value. And now we have that basically set, and we can just populate that into our set state. So nice, simple little function there. Then add event is going to be an asynchronous function. Why? Because we're going to use the await keyword down here in order to wait for our GraphQL operation to finish. And this is exactly what we had in the documentation, right? We're just going to use a mutation here for create event, passing in name, description, where, when, and we're going to ask for all that data back from it. And we're going to use this .state, which is our object that will contain, as you can see, the name, the description, the where, and the when. Thank you, Visual Studio Code, for being smart and figuring out what my state looks like. That's pretty cool. I'll also log it here to the console for now, and then we'll clear out our state so we're ready to add another one if we want. Now, the last thing I need to do is I need to add that new event form to our app so we can see it. And when you have more than one component in React inside, you need to separate them, or you need to enclose both of them. I did that. New event. Oh, I just called it event form, didn't I? Yeah, I just called it event form. We need to put them both inside of another parent container. Okay, let's look at our app again. I didn't import API. So that should come from amplifi. Oh, and I don't need auth actually, because I'm using the with authenticator instead. So that's why that was also grayed out, because it was an unused import. So let's remove that. Okay, cool. Now we've got a form. Let's see if this works. So we'll say Unix's birthday from AT&T. I'll use that as the where too. Why not? 1970-0101. Add event. Now, it won't show up here because, again, we haven't wired that up yet. But if I open the console, yeah, look, it says event created, and there is the data for it from our mutation. I could explore it there, or I could just refresh the page and see the component load it. That worked. Cool. So pretty easy for how to work and affect mutations with the API as well. I hope that makes sense. What plugin need VS Studio for React, asks Michael Mastro Giovanni. Well, the answer there is, I can just show you really quickly. I'm pretty sure I'm using the, I've got React Beautify. That might be it, or it could be ESLint. I have the ESLint plugin as well turned on. So those are the plugins that I've got oh, sorry, I can show them to you here. I was just looking at them off screen. You can see here, I've got ESLint and I've got React Beautify. So it's one of those. I don't remember which one it is. Oh, and the file type here is set to JavaScript React, as you can see down here in the bottom of the stream, right? So that was probably because I configured that in VS Code for certain files. Anyway, moving on, let me go ahead and show subscriptions. Oh, sorry, I see somebody else was asking the same question. Well, let's see if I can figure out what this question is. TubaDC and VJ. If string supported for allow to create the event, is there any SQL injection issue? In this case, no, because we're using a NoSQL database. There's no SQL injection issue possible because, again, we're templatizing this using the values that came out, and I believe they'll be appropriately escaped. Certainly, you can give it a try. This example is very easy to spin up your own, and you can play along with it and see if you can break the template. I don't think that'll be an issue. This is a managed service. We're using AWS AppSync. Oh, cool. Sorry, that's Razor responding. I thought that was a question. Okay, we're okay. And hello, Jack Sav 941, live from the stream. Thank you for joining us. So we've learned how to read data from a GraphQL API, and we've learned how to write data. But what we haven't learned how to do is subscriptions yet. That's another neat feature of AppSync, and I want to show that off. So you can see here, subscriptions are another thing in the doc, and it's pretty easy. It's very similar to queries. You can define your subscriptions about what subscriptions you would like to subscribe to, and then you can say API.GraphQL, subscribe to events. Again, if your subscriptions require properties for them, like different variables, you can pass them in the same shape. This should be no surprise to you. We've just seen that in 2 other cases. And then you say .subscribe, and that you give it a function that knows how to read the data that it's going to basically call back for every time there's new data there. And when you're done being interested in subscribing, you can call subscription.unsubscribe and to stop listening. But it's even easier than that if you're using React, which we are. This connect component also handles subscriptions for us. If I scroll down a bit, you can see right here in the docs, all we need to do is give it a subscription and an on-subscription message property, and then we're off to the races. So let me go ahead and show you that as well. Again, in the interest of time, I'm going to take code I've already written, so you don't have to watch me type a bunch of stuff, but I will walk you through what I'm writing. So in addition to query, we're going to pass 2 other things. A subscription property to connect that is going to use our new events subscription string here, and then a handler called onSubscriptionMessage for what to do when we have new event data. Neither one of these things exists yet, so I'm going to pull them in now. But they're very, very small. So I'll just come right up here and paste them in. So new event subscription basically just says that I would like a subscription, which I'm going to call new events, and it's going to use the subscribe to event subscription and ask for the following information back. Well, it helps if I don't drag it around. Looks like a standard query basically in GraphQL. When I get new data, here's what happens. Amplify's connect component is going to call this handler function and pass it a list of the existing data that it already fetched, which will come through in prev, and an object that has the resulting subscription data from our new subscription, which I'm going to destructure out into a variable called subscribe to event. The responsibility of this handler, if you want connect to update itself, is you just need to return a new set of data. And whatever you return from that new set of data is what connect will re-render itself with. In this case, what I want to do is I want to concatenate the previous data in the same shape that it came in, right? So previous data is list events.items. I want to concatenate onto that list an array that just has the new event in it. And I'll return that back out, and we should be good to go. So hopefully that makes sense. And lastly, what we need to do is teach AppSync about this subscription, because this is not the standard subscription that comes provisioned in the default schema for us. The standard subscription, as you can hopefully see here, let me give us more space, is for subscribing to event comments, which again, for the purpose of the stream, I didn't want to get into comments. I just want to get into events. And so I believe I called it subscribe to event. Yep, that's what I did in my code here, so I'll make it the same. It doesn't need any parameters because it's just going to subscribe to all events. It's going to return a data type of event. And here we have this